Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know, it's Joe Chiffers, the treasurer of this Liverpool UKIP branch. I can highly recommend this book called The Great Deception by Christopher Booker. Most of the content of this mini lecture derives from this book. You can pick up a second-hand copy from Amazon for about £4 or thereabouts. Okay, I'll take some questions at the end, so please, at the end, anybody tell me if you think I've omitted anything that's particularly important. If everybody's got their lecture notes, turn to the first heading, the founding principles. There are 3 quotes by the supranationalists, as I call them. I could have given you hundreds of quotes. There's no particular reason why I've chosen these 3. I won't read them out. I think they speak for themselves. Initially, people were open about their intentions to create a European superstate. It was only when this proposal was unpopular that they started becoming deceitful. And actually, contrary to popular belief, the idea for what is now the European Union didn't come after the Second World War, although that certainly helped their cause. It was actually after the First World War. The idea was that the nation-state had to be emasculated so that there wouldn't be any more world wars, or at least wars within Europe. Now, these people said that they were building Europe from scratch. And in my view, the legacy of that is these expressions that we have now, which conflate Europe as a continent and the European Union. So you have these expressions like Eurosceptic, Europhile, stupid slogans like we need to be in Europe but not run by Europe. Well, of course, we're already in Europe. You can't do much about that. We're not going to pick up the island and move it out. I think these expressions are employed deliberately. I think they're designed to make people who oppose the EU seem xenophobic. By saying they're anti-Europe instead of anti-European Union, you confuse the issue. And if anybody's read George Orwell's 1984, you'll understand the importance of how language can affect the way people think. I therefore advise all of you not to use these expressions like Eurosceptic, or I would just say you're anti the European Union, because that's the truth and it explains exactly what you stand for. Now, if anybody gets a chance, I'd recommend you looking at Jean Monnet's memoirs. He's the most important of the supranationalists. He's commemorated, I think it's in the European Parliament. If it's not that building, it's one of the other main buildings anyway. And he was very clear about his aims. He wanted initially to merge the coal and steel industries because he understood that these resources were so important that if the European states shared these resources, they would, in effect, cease to be independent sovereign states. Now, the European Union was designed to be supranational. It wasn't supposed to involve intergovernmental cooperation. Now, most of you will know what supranational means, or at least you'll have a pretty good idea. But essentially, it's where governments of countries come together and they create some kind of authority which transcends these governments and which binds these governments, and it overrules them and controls them. Whereas if there is intergovernmental cooperation, the member states can fight for their citizens' interests, and if they don't like it, they can walk away. Now, some people will say, well, you can't achieve anything with independent states cooperating, but of course, independent states understand that other independent states are going to fight for their citizens' interests, and eventually a compromise can be reached. If you create something which is supranational, like, for example, the European Commission, it can become a monster which is out of control, because eventually the states which created it will have no control over it. Now, Monnet also wanted the officials not to be elected. That was so they would be not accountable and their first loyalty would be to the institution, not to their countrymen, not to their home states. Now, with the majority of people, you won't need to persuade them that a European superstate is a bad idea. But nonetheless, it's worth bearing in mind a few of the platitudes which are employed by some people who are in favour of the EU. One common platitude is, well, we live in an interdependent world. We can't simply do things on our own anymore. Well, my first response to that is, there are some areas which blatantly don't concern anybody outside of this country. For example, if you sell a product only on the domestic economy, incidentally 80% of our economy is domestic, and you want to sell in imperial measures instead of metric measures, that is no concern of anybody outside of this country. It seems fairly obvious, it's commonsensical, very few people will argue with you. Another common platitude is, well, we need to avoid further wars between nation states. Well, of course, there are some obvious responses to that. Firstly, most wars are fought over freedom. So there's not a lot of point in surrendering our freedom simply to avoid wars. There's another common argument as well in response to that, which is, in the true sense of the word, two liberal democracies have never actually been to war. So those are just some things to bear in mind. But as I say, if a referendum were fought on the concept of a nation-state versus a European superstate, we would win hands down. Inevitably, the tactic that would be employed by the Yes campaign would be one of deceit, not honesty. Now, if everyone could please refer to the second heading, the link between Monnet and the European Union, because some people will want you to demonstrate the link between the supranationalists and the modern EU. First bullet point, in a nutshell, explains how the European Union has evolved. You'll see initially it was the European Coal and Steel Community. Monnet gave his plan to an aide of Schuman, who was the German foreign minister, and he was officially the author of the European Coal and Steel Community, which ultimately became the European Union. And that is therefore the link between this man Monnet, who wanted a European superstate, and the modern European Union. Now, the second heading, why General de Gaulle kept us out of the European Union and why the Labour Party opposed our entry. Now, most of you will know that the Common Agricultural Policy, the contributions you have to make depend on the size of your economy. The handouts you receive depend on the size of your agricultural sector. So, with Great Britain, we have a large economy, the second largest in Europe, but a fairly small agricultural sector. So we're clearly a loser when it comes to the Common Agricultural Policy. De Gaulle knew that, and that's why he initially vetoed Britain's entry, because he knew that we would want to negotiate something more favourable. So he waited until the Common Agricultural Policy was finalised, and then, of course, we were received with open arms, because we would make a disproportionate contribution. You see the second bullet point, in the early 1960s, the then Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell gave a very eloquent speech repudiating the economic arguments in favour of our entry to the European community, and he recognised the true intent of the project.